Smarter, Faster, Better: The Secrets of Being Productive in Life and Business, by Charles Duhigg. Introduction. In the dead of night, 4 hours into a smooth flight from Rio de Janeiro to Paris, the alarms in the cockpit of Air France Flight 447 began to scream. The plane, a massive and sophisticated Airbus A330, was flying on autopilot through a storm. Suddenly, tiny ice crystals clogged a few small sensors on the outside of the aircraft. The autopilot, confused by the lack of data, did exactly what it was designed to do. It switched itself off and handed control back to the human pilots. A warning alarm sounded. A calm voice said, "Stall, stall." The junior pilot, Pierre-Cedric Bonin, took the controls. At this moment, if the pilots had done nothing at all, absolutely nothing, the plane would have continued flying safely. The ice would have melted in a matter of seconds, and everything would have returned to normal. But in the sudden chaos, surrounded by alarms and flashing lights, the pilot did what felt right. He pulled back on his control stick, lifting the plane's nose upward. The plane began to climb. But at 35,000 feet, the air is thin. Lifting the nose of a plane in those conditions is dangerous. It disrupts the flow of air over the wings, and the plane starts to lose the very thing that keeps it in the sky: lift. It begins to fall. The stall alarm blared again. The plane was now dropping out of the sky at a rate of 10,000 feet per minute. The nose was pointed up, but the aircraft was falling like a stone. Inside the cockpit, there was only confusion. "What the hell is happening?" one pilot asked. "I don't have control of the plane anymore," another shouted. "I don't have control of the plane at all." For 4 minutes and 23 seconds, 3 highly trained pilots fought a perfectly functional airplane all the way down into the Atlantic Ocean. They had all the information they needed on their screens. They had the training. They had the skill. So what went wrong? It wasn't a mechanical failure. It wasn't the storm. The thing that brought down Air France Flight 447 was a failure of attention. A breakdown in the simple act of choosing where to focus. It's a failure that happens to all of us, every single day, just with much lower stakes. This is the world that Charles Duhigg, the Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter and author of the bestseller The Power of Habit, explores in his profound book, Smarter, Faster, Better. He asks a simple question: why do some people and companies get so much done, while others just spin their wheels? Why are some people just busy, while others are genuinely productive? The answer, he discovered, has almost nothing to do with working longer hours or sweating harder. It has everything to do with making a handful of key choices that most of us overlook. This book is a journey into the science of productivity, a guide to the 8 critical ideas that can transform the way you work, think, and live. By the end of our time together, you'll understand why the U.S. Marines teach recruits to rebel, how Google built the perfect team by focusing on feelings, and how the creators of Disney's Frozen saved their movie from disaster by embracing creative desperation. This isn't about life hacks or to-do list apps. This is about rewiring the way you think. It's about learning to be smarter, faster, and better at everything you do. Book summary. The journey to becoming smarter, faster, and better begins in a place you might not expect, inside your own mind, with a force we all struggle with: motivation. We've all been there. You have a big project, a deadline looming, or even just a mountain of emails to get through, and you just can't start. You'd rather do anything else. That feeling isn't a character flaw, it's a failure of a specific mental trigger. Duhigg tells the story of the U.S. Marine Corps. In the late 1990s, a general named Charles Krulak realized that the young recruits arriving at boot camp were different. They'd grown up following instructions their whole lives. They lacked a sense of internal drive. The problem was, modern warfare required Marines who could think for themselves, who could make decisions in the middle of chaos without waiting for an order. They needed to teach self-motivation. So, they redesigned boot camp. They still had the screaming drill instructors and the grueling marches, but they added something new. They started forcing recruits to make choices. In one exercise, a platoon would be told to clean the entire mess hall, but they wouldn't be told where the cleaning supplies were or how the industrial dishwasher worked. The drill instructors would just stand there, silent. The recruits had to figure it out. They had to make decisions. They'd inevitably make mistakes. They once used so much soap they flooded the kitchen with bubbles, but that wasn't the point. The point was to give them a feeling of control. This brings us to the first secret of productivity. Motivation is triggered by making choices that demonstrate to ourselves that we are in control. Scientists call this having an internal locus of control, a belief that you have authority over your actions and your surroundings. When you feel like you're in charge, even in a small way, your brain releases a little jolt of excitement. That's the spark of motivation. If you're struggling to reply to a pile of emails, don't just start from the top. Pick one from the middle, or the one that looks most interesting. Make a choice. If you're trying to write an essay, don't start with the introduction. Start with a conclusion, or a paragraph you're excited about. By making a small decision, you're sending a signal to your brain, I'm in the driver's seat. But there's a second piece to this puzzle. The Marines also taught recruits to ask each other why. In the middle of a miserable, exhausting hike, one Marine would ask another, "Why are you doing this?" And the other would have to answer with something meaningful. "To build a better life for my family. To become someone my daughter can look up to." They were linking a difficult chore to a deeper value. And that's the second half of the motivation secret. Self-motivation becomes easiest when we see our choices as affirmations of our deepest goals and values. A task is no longer just a task, it's a step towards something you truly care about. Replying to that boring email isn't just about clearing your inbox, it's about being a reliable teammate, which is a value you hold. Doing that math homework isn't just about the grade, it's a step toward getting into the college you've dreamed of. So, when you feel that familiar drag of procrastination, the path forward is twofold. First, find a choice, any choice, that gives you a sense of agency. Second, take a moment to ask yourself why this small task matters in the grand scheme of your life. Turn the chore into a meaningful choice, and motivation will almost always follow. Of course, motivation is just the start. What do you do with that energy once you have it? You need a target. You need a goal. But as Duhigg discovered, the way most of us set goals is fundamentally broken. He tells the story of General Electric in the 1980s. GE was a titan of industry, and they were obsessed with a goal-setting system that would eventually take over the world: SMART goals. You've probably heard of them. A goal has to be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. And it worked. Forcing people to break down their ambitions into concrete, manageable plans was incredibly effective. But GE noticed something strange. Some of their factories, despite being filled with people setting perfect SMART goals, were failing. When consultants went to investigate, they found people setting beautifully detailed, perfectly realistic goals for incredibly trivial tasks. One administrative assistant had a SMART goal for ordering office supplies. A security team had a SMART goal for building a new fence. They were so focused on the feeling of accomplishment that comes from checking a box that they had lost sight of the bigger picture. They were busy, but they weren't productive. This reveals a deep psychological trap. Our brains crave closure. We love the feeling of finishing something, anything, and SMART goals can feed that craving. We end up spending all day on easy, unimportant tasks just to feel that little rush of completion, while our biggest, most important ambitions gather dust. The solution, Jack Welch, GE's legendary CEO, realized, came from the story of Japan's bullet train. In the 1950s, Japanese engineers were asked to build a faster train. They came back with a design that was incrementally better. The head of the railway said, "Not good enough. I want a train that goes twice as fast." The engineers said it was impossible. The tracks couldn't handle it. The mountains were in the way. "Then build new tracks," the leader said. "Dig tunnels through the mountains." He gave them what Duhigg calls a stretch goal, an ambition so huge and audacious that it forces you to rethink everything. To achieve the impossible, the engineers couldn't just improve the old way, they had to invent a completely new one. And this is the second secret of productivity. To achieve great things, you need to pair a huge ambition with a concrete plan. You need both a stretch goal and a SMART goal. Here's how you can use this. Start with your biggest, craziest ambition. The one that feels almost impossible. Write it at the top of a piece of paper. Maybe it's start my own company, or run a marathon, or get a perfect score on my SATs. That's your stretch goal. It's your North Star. Then, underneath it, break it down. What is the first, tiny, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound step you can take? If you want to run a marathon, your SMART goal might be, this week, I will run for 20 minutes on Tuesday and Thursday. The stretch goal provides the meaning and the motivation. It answers the why. The SMART goal provides the path. It answers the how. When you put them together, you create a powerful system that keeps you from getting lost in either direction. You won't get paralyzed by the size of your ambition, and you won't get distracted by the thrill of completing tiny, unimportant tasks. You'll be making real progress on the things that truly matter. So now you're motivated, and you have a system for setting goals. But we rarely work alone. We are part of teams, in school, in sports, in our jobs, in our families. And what Duhigg found is that the secrets to a great team have nothing to do with what we think. He takes us inside Google, a company obsessed with data. Google wanted to build the perfect team, so they launched a massive study called Project Aristotle. They analyzed everything. Were the best teams made up of introverts or extroverts? Did teammates need to be friends outside of work? Should they have a strong leader or a flat hierarchy? For years, they crunched the numbers, and they found nothing. There were no patterns. The who on the team didn't seem to matter. Some great teams were friends, others were strangers. Some had strong managers, others didn't. They were about to give up. Then, they started looking not at who was on the team, but at how the team behaved. They looked at the unwritten rules, the group norms. And suddenly, patterns emerged. The best teams, the ones that were smarter and more creative than everyone else, shared two specific behaviors. First, on the best teams, everyone spoke in roughly the same proportion. It wasn't that everyone had to speak in every meeting, but by the end of the day or the week, the conversational turn-taking balanced out. No one person dominated, and no one stayed silent. Everyone had a voice. Second, the members of the best teams had high average social sensitivity. This is a fancy way of saying they were good at reading each other's feelings based on tone of voice and nonverbal cues. They noticed when someone was feeling upset or left out. They cared about how their teammates felt. These two behaviors created a powerful dynamic that Harvard professor Amy Edmondson calls psychological safety. Psychological safety is a shared belief that the team is a safe place for interpersonal risk-taking. It's the feeling that you can speak up, share a crazy idea, admit a mistake, or ask a question without fear of being embarrassed or punished. This is the third secret of productivity. The best teams are not the ones with the most superstars, they are the ones with the most psychological safety. To drive this point home, Duhigg takes us to the early days of Saturday Night Live. You'd think the original cast, John Belushi, Gilda Radner, Dan Aykroyd, was a tight-knit family. But behind the scenes, it was chaos. They were fiercely competitive, jealous, and fought all the time. They were not friends. So why were they so brilliant together? Because their leader, Lorne Michaels, cultivated psychological safety. He made sure everyone, even the quietest writer, got a chance to pitch their ideas. He was incredibly sensitive to their emotions, knowing when to push and when to offer a soothing word. They fought, but they felt safe enough to take creative risks. They could be vicious with their critiques, but everyone knew it wasn't personal. It was about making the show better. They trusted each other enough to be honest. To build psychological safety in your own team, whether it's for a school project or a sports team, you don't need to force everyone to be friends. You just need to model two things. Make sure everyone gets a chance to talk, and show that you're paying attention to how people feel. If you're the leader, don't interrupt. Summarize what people say to show you're listening. Encourage people to share their frustrations. When a team feels safe, it becomes smarter than its smartest member. Building this kind of trust is at the heart of another powerful idea: how to manage others effectively. Duhigg takes us to a General Motors car factory in Fremont, California, in the 1980s. It was, by all accounts, the worst auto plant in the world. Workers drank on the job, sabotaged cars, and cared nothing for quality. The plant was a war zone between management and the union. GM finally gave up and shut it down. A few years later, Toyota partnered with GM to reopen the same plant, with the same terrible workers. It was called NUMMI. The Toyota executives did something radical. They flew these skeptical, hardened American auto workers to Japan to see the Toyota production system in action. One worker, Rick Madrid, watched a man on the assembly line misthread a bolt, a simple mistake. At the old GM plant, the worker would have just let it go. The rule was, the line never stops. But in Japan, the worker reached up and pulled a rope, called an ondo cord. A light flashed, and a moment later, the entire assembly line ground to a halt. Madrid was stunned. He had once seen a man have a heart attack and fall into the assembly pit, and they didn't even stop the line. But here, they stopped everything for a single bolt. A manager ran over, not to yell, but to help. The worker, the lowest person on the totem pole, was in charge. He gave orders to his boss. This was the core of the Toyota philosophy, which would become known as lean manufacturing. The fourth secret of productivity is to push decision-making down to the people who are closest to the problem. Toyota trusted its workers. They gave them the power to stop the entire factory because they believed that the person installing the bolt knows more about that job than anyone else. This created a commitment culture. When the workers returned to California, they were transformed. They knew management trusted them, so they committed to the company's success. Within a year, the worst auto plant in America, with the exact same workers, became one of the most productive plants in the world. This idea has since spread everywhere. In software development, it's called agile programming. At the FBI, it helped fix their disastrous computer system, Sentinel, by empowering junior agents and programmers to make decisions without waiting for a dozen layers of approval. When you give people a sense of authority and show you're committed to their success, they become more motivated, more innovative, and more responsible. Now, let's step back into the cockpit. You're motivated, you have your goals, your team trusts each other. But a crisis hits. The alarms are blaring. The unexpected has happened. What do? This brings us back to Air France Flight 447. The pilots were overwhelmed. Their brains entered a state called cognitive tunneling. This is what happens when your attention suddenly snaps from a relaxed state to a high alert state. Your brain's instinct is to focus its spotlight on the most obvious thing in front of you, even if it's the wrong thing. The pilot, Bonin, saw a small icon on his screen that was slightly off kilter. He became obsessed with leveling it, ignoring the stall alarms and the simple fact that he was pulling the plane's nose up into a fatal climb. His co-pilot was tunneling too, staring at a screen of scrolling text messages from the computer, reading them aloud instead of looking at the instruments or his partner's actions. They had information, but they didn't know where to focus. Now, let's contrast this with another flight, Qantas 32. A year after the Air France crash, another Airbus, this one flown by Captain Richard de Crespigny, suffered a catastrophic engine explosion shortly after takeoff from Singapore. It was one of the worst mid-air mechanical disasters in modern aviation history. Hundreds of alarms went off. 21 of the plane's 22 major systems were damaged. But Captain de Crespigny and his crew stayed calm. They landed the crippled plane safely, and all 469 people on board survived. How? The difference was the fifth secret of productivity. The best way to maintain focus is to build mental models, to tell yourself stories about what you expect to see. Before every flight, Captain de Crespigny would walk his crew through potential disasters. Imagine there's an engine failure, he'd say. Where's the first place you'll look? He was forcing them to build mental models, to create stories in their minds about the future. When the real disaster struck, their brains weren't caught off guard. They had a story to follow. They knew where to direct their attention. When the computer was spewing out hundreds of contradictory instructions, de Crespigny did something brilliant. He said, "Let's stop focusing on what's wrong and start paying attention to what's still working." He decided to reframe the situation. He told himself, what if I imagine this massive, broken Airbus is just a simple, little Cessna plane? What would I do then? That news story, that simple mental model, allowed him to filter out the noise and focus only on the basics: fuel, controls, landing gear. It simplified the chaos and allowed him to fly the plane. We can use this in our own lives. Before you walk into a big meeting, tell yourself a story about how it will unfold. What points will you make? What questions will your boss ask? What objections will your colleagues raise? By creating a mental model, you're preparing your brain to focus on what matters when the unexpected happens. You're no longer just reacting, you're directing your attention with purpose. This ability to think about the future is also the key to our sixth secret: how to make better decisions. Duhigg introduces us to Annie Duke, a former PhD student in cognitive psychology who became one of the best poker players in the world. For Annie, poker wasn't about gambling. It was a laboratory for decision-making under uncertainty. The secret she learned from her brother, another poker legend, was that amateurs are always looking for certainty. They want to know if they have the winning hand. But professionals are different. Great decision-makers get comfortable with uncertainty. They practice what's called probabilistic thinking. They don't see the future as a single, predetermined outcome. They see it as a range of possibilities, each with a different probability of happening. This is a form of Bayesian psychology. It's the idea that even with very little information, we can make a reasonable prediction by starting with an initial assumption of base rate and then updating it as we get new information. For example, when Annie sits down at a table with a new player, she starts with stereotypes. A young kid in a poker t-shirt, probably learned online, plays a tight game. A middle-aged businessman, probably here for fun, will take big risks. These are her initial assumptions. But she doesn't get stuck there. With every hand, she updates her model. If the businessman plays conservatively, she adjusts her prediction. She's constantly asking, what does this new piece of information tell me about the future? The key to making better decisions is to train yourself to think this way. When you're faced with a choice, don't just fixate on the outcome you hope will happen. Force yourself to envision multiple futures. What are all the different ways this could play out? Then, ask yourself, what are the odds of each? And how do you get better at estimating those odds? By exposing yourself to a wider range of experiences, especially failures. Successful people often study success, but the wisest decision-makers, Duhigg says, are obsessed with failure. They talk to friends who got fired. They read about companies that went bankrupt. They analyze their own mistakes. Why? Because failures give you a more realistic base rate. They ground your predictions in reality, not just optimism. Making a good decision isn't about finding the right answer. It's about accurately calculating the odds and choosing the path that is most likely to lead to success over the long run, even if it feels uncertain in the moment. So what happens when the problem isn't just making a decision, but creating something entirely new? How do you innovate, especially when you're under pressure? This brings us to the seventh secret of productivity, found in the story of Disney's Frozen. 18 months before its release date, Frozen was a disaster. In the original story, Elsa was a straightforward, bitter villain. Anna was an uptight hero. The story had no heart, and the filmmakers knew it. They were in a state of what psychologists call creative desperation. The breakthrough came when they stopped trying to invent something totally new and started practicing what sociologists call innovation brokerage. This is the art of taking old, proven ideas from different worlds and combining them in a new way. Creativity, Duhigg argues, isn't about a magical stroke of genius. It's about connecting things. The most creative people are like intellectual middlemen. They have a wide range of experiences and can see how an idea from one field could solve a problem in another. To save Frozen, the team started looking inward, brokering ideas from their own lives. Jennifer Lee, the writer, talked about her complicated relationship with her own sister. The songwriters, Kristen Anderson Lopez and Bobby Lopez, were walking in a park, stressed and anxious, when they asked, what would it really feel like to be Elsa? Kristen, a working mother, knew what it felt like to be judged for not being perfect. She channeled that feeling of frustration and liberation into a song. It started with a fairy tale melody and exploded into a powerful pop anthem. The song was Let It Go. When the team heard it, they knew they had found the heart of their movie. This song didn't fit the villain Elsa they had written. This was the song of someone who was misunderstood and scared, someone who was finally embracing who she was. Let It Go was so powerful that it forced them to rewrite the entire movie around it. Elsa was no longer the villain. She was a hero struggling with fear. The movie became a story of love versus fear. The lesson is that we all have a wealth of creative material inside us, our own experiences, emotions, and frustrations. To innovate, we need to become brokers of our own lives. Pay attention to how things make you feel. That's how you find the truth that separates a cliché from a genuine insight. And don't be afraid of that feeling of panic when you're stuck. Creative desperation is often the spark that forces us to connect old ideas in new ways. But there's one last piece. In this modern world, we are drowning in information. We have data on everything. So how do we turn all that noise into actual knowledge? This is the final secret, and Duhigg illustrates it with the story of a failing school in Cincinnati called South Avondale. The school had all the data in the world. Administrators had fancy online dashboards tracking every student's attendance, test scores, and homework. But the school was still in an academic emergency. Teachers were so overwhelmed by the flood of spreadsheets and reports that they ignored them. They were suffering from information blindness. The district decided to try something radical. They created a data room, and they forced the teachers to do something that seemed incredibly inefficient. They had to take all that digital data and transcribe it by hand onto index cards. They had to draw graphs on butcher paper and tape them to the walls. They made the information disfluent. Disfluency means making something harder to process. And paradoxically, when information is slightly harder to process, we learn it more deeply. When you take notes by hand instead of on a laptop, you can't write down every word. You are forced to listen, process, and summarize. You are doing something with the information. That small bit of labor forces you to engage with the material, and you remember it better. That's what happened in the Cincinnati data room. As teachers physically handled the index cards, sorting them into piles based on which students were struggling with similar problems, they started to see patterns they had never noticed before. They weren't just passively receiving data, they were interacting with it. They were turning information into knowledge. They realized a group of students in one class was great at pronouns but bad at fractions, while a class next door had the opposite problem. So, the teachers traded lesson plans. Scores went up. They saw that students living in the same neighborhood were struggling with the same reading assignments, so they started giving them homework they could do together on the bus. Scores went up again. By making the data harder to work with, they made it more useful. The final secret of productivity is this: to truly learn, we have to do something with our data. When you encounter a new idea, don't just read it. Explain it to a friend. When you track your spending, don't just look at the app. Write the numbers down and ask yourself what they mean. Every choice we make is an experiment, and every experience is a piece of data. The trick is to force ourselves to engage with it, to manipulate it, to turn it over in our hands until it becomes a part of how we see the world. Commentary. When you step back and look at the 8 secrets in Smarter, Faster, Better, a single, powerful idea comes into focus: productivity is not a hack. It's not about finding the perfect app or a magical morning routine. It's a skill, rooted in a very human desire to find meaning and control in what we do. What Charles Duhigg has given us is a new vocabulary for thinking about our own work and lives. He shows us that the feeling of being overwhelmed, of being busy but not effective, is not a personal failing. It's often the result of choices we don't even realize we're making. We let our motivation drift because we forget to assert our control. We set vague goals because we're afraid of the clarity that a real plan demands. We work in teams that stifle good ideas because we haven't learned to build psychological safety. We get lost in distraction because we haven't told ourselves a story about where to focus. The most profound lesson in this book, for me, is that becoming more productive is an act of mindfulness. It requires us to step back from the frantic pace of our lives and ask simple questions. Why am I doing this? What do I expect to happen? How does my team feel? What are the other possibilities? What can this failure teach me? These are not questions about efficiency. They are questions about purpose. And that's why this book is so much more than a guide to getting more done. It's a guide to living a more deliberate life. So, how can you start applying these ideas right now? Here are 3 simple actions you can take today. First, find a choice. The next time you face a task you are dreading, don't just dive in. Stop and find one small decision you can make about how you will do it. Where will you sit? What part will you do first? What music will you listen to? Reclaim a small piece of control, and feel the spark of motivation return. Second, tell a story. Before your next important class, meeting, or even a difficult conversation, take just 2 minutes to envision how you want it to unfold. What is the best-case scenario? What are the likely obstacles? How will you handle them? By creating a simple mental model, you are preparing your mind to focus on what truly matters. And third, embrace disfluency. The next time you learn something important, from a book, a lecture, a podcast, don't just let the information wash over you. Do something with it. Write down the key ideas in your own words. Explain the concept to a friend. Find one small way to test the idea in your own life. The small effort of interacting with information is what transforms it into wisdom. That was a summary of Smarter, Faster, Better by Charles Duhigg. We've journeyed through some of the biggest ideas today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary can only ever be a map. The real treasure is found when you make the journey yourself. The true magic of a book like this happens in the quiet moments of reading, when a particular story or a simple phrase connects with your own life in a way you didn't expect. This summary is a starting point, designed to help you decide if this book deserves your time. If anything we've talked about has sparked a sense of curiosity or a desire for change, I encourage you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning. It's an experience that can genuinely change the way you see yourself and the world around you. The link to the book is in the description below. Also, if you found this journey valuable, please take a moment to click that like button and subscribe to the channel. It tells us we're on the right track, and it ensures you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together.